We're also at the end of the event, we're going to be circulating a survey. We really value your feedback, what you thought of the event, how you heard of it, etc. For those online, we'll also be sending later electronic version of the survey. So I understand that we have the mic that's available both here and also in the room. And so any conversations between people, the mic may pick up as well. So if you can just keep those to a minimum while the speakers are talking, that way people can get their audio. And certainly anyone on Zoom, if you're having any problems hearing us, don't hesitate to let us know. I think that's it for my remarks. I'll turn it over to Dean Boone to introduce our speaker for today. Thanks everyone for being here.
Bonjour tout le monde, je m'appelle Kristen Boone, je suis la doyenne Perry et Susan Delis, ici à la Faculté de droit, Université d'Ottawa. It's great to see all of you here today to launch this year's Conway Professionalism Series speaker. I would like to begin with a land acknowledgement. Nous rendons hommage au peuple algonquin, gardien traditionnel de cette terre. Nous reconnaissons le lien sacré de longue durée à ce territoire qui demeure non cédé. Nous rendons également hommage à l'Ottawa, qu'il soit de la région ou d'ailleurs au Canada. Nous reconnaissons les gardiens des savoirs traditionnels, jeunes et âgés. Nous honorons aussi leurs courageux dirigeants d'hier, d'aujourd'hui et de demain. Each year, through our professionalism speaker series, we host talks at the law school on topics related to research, ethics, and the legal profession. Since 2009, when this series was first started, over 4,000 law students, lawyers, judges, and professors have attended more than 100 presentations on a wide variety of topics. I'm pleased to note that today's talk sold out in just a matter of days. Quelle façon de commencer la nouvelle année académique. Previous speakers have included judges of the Supreme Court of Canada, the Ontario Court of Appeal, the Superior Court of Justice, the Ontario Court of Appeal, the former Ontario Attorney General Michel Brion, David Asper, and ventures and leading academics. We are very grateful to Conway Baxter Wilson for its leadership in making this series possible and providing financial support for these events. Stay tuned for further events this fall and into the spring. Today's speaker literally needs no introduction. Adam DODEK has been a professor at the University of Ottawa's Faculty of Common Law Program since 2008, and he served as its dean from 2018 to 2021. He's one of the founders of the Canadian Association for Legal Ethics and of this series. His teaching is in the area of legal ethics, judicial ethics, public law, and the Supreme Court of Canada. Professor DODEK has authored more than 50 book chapters. He has written or edited 8 books. His book, The Canadian Constitution, was named one of the top 100 books on Canadian public policy by the Hill Times. And his book, Solicitor-Client Privilege, was the winner of the Walter Owen Book Prize Award. Professor DODEK has received numerous honors in his academic career, and I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Adam for his leadership at the faculty and for his continuing guidance and advice to me since I have assumed the deanship. I have called Adam on a number of occasions, and I'm really grateful to be following in his shoes. Many of you might have wondered what Adam was up to on his year away. Well, today he's going to tell you. He's been writing a book on the rise and fall of the law firm HEENAN BLAIKIE. I haven't read the manuscript yet. I understand he's up to chapter 20. I do have a spy who has read it, and he tells me that it's fascinating. I'm happy to tell you this might even be next year's beach read. So, some of you know I spent a couple of years working in New York at Debevoise and Plimpton, so I know a little bit about law firm culture, but I think this is a Canadian story that needs telling, and we are really happy to have Adam here today as the inaugural speaker. We look forward to hearing about his progress, and there will be questions and answers. Thank you, Adam. Welcome, and I look forward to today's discussion.
Thank you so much, Dean Boone. It's that really warm introduction. People can say they know how busy you are. I actually know how busy you are. I'm really honored that you're able to be here today.
We have as many people online. I just want to be sure that these.
Ma présentation aujourd'hui sera en anglais. Et si vous avez des questions en français, je serai ravi d'essayer de répondre à votre question en français parce que l'histoire d'Heenan Blaikie, c'est vraiment une histoire bilingue et aussi c'est une histoire très, très. Ready?
Yes.
If it takes a village to raise a child, it takes a community to support a scholar. And I want to start off by thanking the partners and the lawyers at Conway, Baxter, Wilson, and for their support of this series. See that Marion Sandilands is here representing the Conway firm today, so thank you very much for your support. I've had the privilege of knowing Tom Conway and some of the other lawyers at Conway, Baxter, Wilson now for more than 20 years. And these are lawyers who are deeply engaged in the legal profession, in community support, and I can't think of a better sponsor for this lecture series. Many people have supported me in my research in many ways over the years, and I'm tremendously appreciative to all of this. This project is funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council. And I would not have been able to get that grant without the support of two critical people. One is Dr. Cynthia Quiroga, who is the Assistant Dean for Research at our faculty. And the other is Professor Constance Backhouse. And both of them enabled me to get this grant, provided tremendous support throughout this project. The grant from SSHRC allowed me to interview over 200 lawyers and employees and articling students and others who worked at Heenan Blaikie between the years of 1973 and 2014. I'm incredibly thankful to each and every one of them for their generosity and for their insights. Over the years, I've had a number of superb research assistants who are students at this faculty, some who are still working on this project with me, and I want to acknowledge them and thank them for their work. So let's begin. As many of you know, was one of the largest law firms in Canada. In 2012, it counted 561 lawyers and 8 offices across Canada, making it, according to the Law Times, the 7th largest law firm in Canada. It was a great Canadian success story. But by 2014, it had flatlined. It was no more. Within 2 years, the collapse quickly sent shockwaves through the legal profession and pushed 500 lawyers and close to 1,000 staff on the street looking for employment. It was by far the largest law firm collapse in Canadian history, and it still remains the only national law firm in Canada ever to go out of business. I can't possibly do justice in 40 or 45 minutes to the 40 years of history at Heenan Blaikie. So what I hope to accomplish is merely to raise some themes which will be developed in the eventual book. I don't know if it will be a beach read, but hopefully it'll be interesting. I'll make some comments about the collapse at the end, but my presentation today is going to focus on the creation and the early years. And these are the themes that I will identify. At Heenan Blaikie, it all began with a handshake. Back when Heenan Blaikie was founded in 1973, large law firms, and they were known as large law firms, were not quite so large as they are today. In Toronto, there were only 3 law firms with more than 50 lawyers. In Montreal, there was only 1 law firm with more than 50 lawyers. Martin O'Rourke had just over 30 lawyers. This is the context in which Don Johnson, Peter Blaikie, and Roy Heenan shook hands to create their law firm in 1973. These were three extraordinary men. Johnston and Blaikie had left Stikeman Elliott in 1967 with two other lawyers to found a firm called McCarthy, Monet, and Johnston, and a year later, Roy Heenan joined them. After 5 years, they decided to strike out on their own. They were all men in their mid-30s when they founded Heenan Blaikie, but they had already established reputations as leaders in their field. They were all McGill grads, and that connection to their alma mater was critical, both to the creation of Heenan Blaikie and to its identity. Johnston was a noted tax expert. He had been the gold medalist at McGill, and he was the golden child at Stikeman Elliott. His decision to leave Stikeman Elliott literally sent shockwaves through that firm. Blaikie was a Rhodes Scholar who returned from Oxford to teach high school in his native Shawinigan. He then went on to study law at McGill, and he was both a business lawyer and a litigator who would be Heenan's managing partner for the first 2 decades. And Roy Heenan was born in Mexico and immigrated to Canada when he was 12 years old. By the time of the founding of Heenan Blaikie in 1973, he was already established as one of Canada's top management side labor lawyers. These three men were all politically engaged with very much the issues of the day in Montreal in the 1970s, which meant the future of Quebec in Canada and the future of Canada itself. Their partnership was strong, but the partnership of the three would not last that long. Because in 1978, Don Johnson got the political bug, as we say, and left the firm to run for Parliament and got elected and eventually became a minister in the Trudeau government. In 1993, Peter left to pursue a short but very successful career in business. He had been the firm's only managing partner since its creation in 1973. From that point on, Heenan Blaikie, despite its name, was essentially Roy's firm. He was the chairman, a position he would not relinquish until 2012 when he was 77 years old. He was the only chairman that the firm would ever know. He had become so intertwined with the firm itself that he was literally irreplaceable. When these three men shook hands in 1973, they're plotting their firm at meetings at McGill University, they did so with intention. And they intended to create a different sort of law firm. What did that mean? For them, it meant quite a few things. It meant a firm without hierarchy, with loose structure, a firm that was entrepreneurial, a firm that went out and sought out business. They weren't one of the old established firms that had big institutional clients that they had inherited. Some of those other firms on the slide that you saw are older than Canada itself. That wasn't Heenan Blaikie. They were new, they were young, they were hungry, they were upstart, they were eager. They identified a number of founding principles. The first, the core of the handshake, was that they would have no written partnership agreement. And this came from their brief time together at the McCarthy, Monet, Johnston firm, where they had spent so much time arguing with each other and their partners about what the partnership agreement would look like. The three of them said, to hell with that. We want to spend our time fighting the competition, not fighting each other. And therefore, they eschewed a written partnership agreement. The second is that they would avoid large differences in compensation between different types of lawyers. often referred to as finders, minders, and grinders, those who get the work, the big rainmakers, those who have responsibility for clients, and those who grind it out doing the work. And the third principle, flowing from the second, is that the differences between the highest paid lawyer and the most junior partners would be modest. The fourth principle was that client work would be the responsibility for the client, and work would be delegated as soon as possible. Another part of the identity of creating a different sort of law firm was a conscious attempt to make HEENAN BLAIKIE a Montreal law firm. Well into the 1960s, legal practice and law firms in Montreal were very much divided along language and religious lines. In Montreal, most firms were either English or French. And if they were English, they were either Gentile or Jewish. Don, Roy, and Peter, they were all Anglophones, but they were all proudly bilingual. And they established a precedent that continued until the very end of the firm that would operate bilingually. Lawyers across the country received memos into the 2000s in both English and French. Some of the first lawyers at the firm were Francophones, and early hires like Jean Papin and Guy Tremblay would become important leaders in the firm. Jean Chrétien, who was well known for having joined the firm after he stepped down as prime minister in 2003, first joined the firm in 1979 in the brief hiatus when the Trudeau Liberals lost an election to Joe Clark's Progressive Conservatives. 3 of the first 10 lawyers at HEENAN BLAIKIE were women, something that was notable at the time. Quebec was the last province to allow women to practice law, but it was one of the first provinces to embrace women in the practice of law. And in the early 1970s, women were entering law school in Quebec and graduating from law school and entering the legal practice at much higher numbers than in Ontario or in other provinces. Many Jewish lawyers would flock to HEENAN BLAIKIE, at one point making it apparently the 3rd largest Jewish law firm in Montreal. This would later have important consequences, with McCall moving from Montreal to Toronto to open up HEENAN's office in Toronto in 1989. But as you can see, there were limits to this diversity. Like most law firms in Montreal and most large law firms across Canada, HEENAN BLAIKIE remained almost exclusively a white law firm. HEENAN BLAIKIE considered itself a different sort of law firm. What were some of these other elements? One of them was about the importance of having fun. This is not something that is frequently associated with large law firms. And when I spoke to these 200 lawyers who had worked at HEENAN BLAIKIE, this was often a theme that came up for lawyers who worked at HEENAN in the 70s, in the 80s, certainly into the 90s. Work is an important part of your life, but it's not your life, so have a life. People said that Don would say to them, you come to work to have fun. If you're not having fun, then something's wrong. In the 1970s, this plucky little law firm had a clubhouse atmosphere. People would be tossing footballs down the hall, and Peter Blaikie, who was a rather tall and intimidating man, would be doing somersaults down the hall in his suit. And of course, everywhere was surrounded by Roy's art. Roy Heenan was one of the acknowledged patrons of Canadian art. And he was a collector. He was a member of the board of the Musée des Beaux-Arts in Montreal. He had an exhibition dedicated to his art at the gallery in New Brunswick. His art, Canadian modern art at the time, was not the sort of bright art that was displayed in the wood paneled offices Bay Street in corporate Montreal. Heenan Blaikie looked different and it felt different. Unlike many law firms, it was a place where most people felt that they could be themselves at work. And it was that culture that Norm Bacall transplanted to Toronto when he opened the office there in 1989. By that time, Heenan Blaikie had already been put on the map nationwide. And that was really due to a singular event in 1984. I called it the game changer. Until 1984, in the first decade of Heenan Blaikie, Don, Roy, and Peter had built a close-knit law firm that felt like it was going somewhere. From 3 lawyers on a handshake over a decade, they had grown to 39 lawyers. The 40th was the game changer, and that was Pierre Trudeau.
Huh.
Trudeau brought the firm instant legitimacy. And I love that reaction. That reaction is the idea, I didn't know that Trudeau was associated with Heenan Blaikie. For people under the age, I would say, of
Be careful.
it's hard to appreciate what a huge public figure Pierre Trudeau was. Pierre Trudeau was named the Canadian newsmaker of the century, of the 20th century. In these halls, we may talk about him as in terms of the patriation of the Constitution in 1982. He was a huge media figure. He was the press, and the press was very different in the 70s. There was a vibrant press, and the press followed him everywhere. They were concerned. He was at one point Canada's most eligible bachelor. We have heard of Trudeau mania and the wild excitement around Trudeau, which for many of your generation can only be compared to Obama. Trudeau was seen and allegedly dated Barbara Streisand, Kim Cattrall, who some of you may know from her starring in Sex and the City, and Margot Kidder, a Vancouver actress who was the first Lois Lane. The media followed Trudeau, and this was a time when the media had a society page and a beat reporter, and they would say Trudeau was seen here with this person, etc. He brought Heenan Blaikie instant legitimacy. In the top slide, you see a newscaster, Knowlton Nash, announcing on the national newscast, which people used to watch, that it was reported that the next day, and this is November 1984, Pierre Trudeau was going to join a quote unquote local law firm. The media showed up at his door. He was wearing a skin tight t-shirt and he slammed the door in their face. The next day he showed up, and this is the picture of him with the microphone in his face in the bottom left corner, wearing his customary beautiful tailored suit with his rose in his lapel, holding a press conference in the offices of this local law firm that was then broadcast nationwide. Norm Bacall, the former managing partner of Heenan Blaikie, who's written a book about his experiences, talked about the Trudeau effect. And Bacall is absolutely right. You cannot underestimate the impact of hiring not just a former prime minister, but the media star of the century to a local law firm who at that time had 1 office and 40 lawyers. Trudeau didn't bring the firm much business, but that we shouldn't minimize his role as an asset. Trudeau was fiercely independent. He was also independently wealthy. He didn't need and he wasn't interested in a 6-figure salary from Heenan Blaikie. He was not someone who wanted to be beholden to anyone. So really, after a year, he went to the manager and said, you know what, I want to call my own shots. I don't want to be beholden to anyone. At some point, it was rumored that he turned down a request to make a speech in in a foreign country for $800,000, a remarkable amount of money at that time. And the grounds, he said, well, if I give this one speech, then other people will want me to give speeches. The effect that Trudeau had in sort of projecting the firm outward was huge, but also in uniting the firm. Trudeau made the people who worked at HEENAN Blaikie feel special. And the stories that people told me about their encounters with the great man, about how they would bring their parents to work to meet him, to shake his hand, to get a picture. They would introduce clients. Trudeau, despite being this powerful personality and political figure who was renowned for taking on the opposition, taking on his political opposition, for fighting in Parliament, for standing up to the media, was actually in person quite shy. And he often would have lunch by himself in the food fair in the basement of the building. Now that's been rebranded as the dining hall at Rideau Center, but in those days it used to be called a food fair, where you would take your tray, sit at a table, and young lawyers would hesitantly come up and ask Mr. Trudeau if they could join him for lunch. And he always said yes. So whether they were in Montreal, certainly, but also the lawyers in Toronto, and then later in Vancouver, would see Trudeau at firm retreats, going skiing, at meetings, and they would feel that they were a part of something special, feel that they were a part of something Canadian, of the Canadian National Project. And they also felt that it was like a family. If I probably did a search of phrases that former lawyers and employees of HEENAN Blaikie said, this would probably come up at least in the top 3, if not the top search. People felt that people at HEENAN Blaikie, that their colleagues were not just their colleagues, they were their friends, and that they were like a family. And what they meant by that was that their colleagues bona fidely cared about them, supported them, mentored them. We often lament the lack of mentoring in the legal profession. What I heard from former HEENAN Blaikie lawyers, certainly in Montreal and Toronto in the early years, was the opposite of that. A commitment to mentoring, to helping new lawyers. It also meant, like, as you know, in your family, you can just sort of be yourself for good or for bad. Nobody's putting on airs or trying to be somebody else when you're around the Thanksgiving table or you're back visiting your family. And at HEENAN Blaikie, it was a place where you could be yourself at work. You didn't have to pretend to be someone else. And I think the critical question is, how do you sustain that? Is it sustainable? Because another aspect of HEENAN Blaikie, and another phrase that people mentioned over and over again, was growth was in our DNA. Part of the reason that Roy and Don and Peter left McCarthy, Monet, Johnson, HEENAN in 1973 to create HEENAN Blaikie was a philosophical clash. Their partners were just sort of happy doing what they were doing. And Johnston, HEENAN, and Blaikie, as the firm was originally known, had a view to become a full-service law firm. Hard to be a full-service law firm with 3 lawyers. And so they knew that they would have to grow to serve the growing demands of their clients and in various areas. And so the 1990s, HEENAN Blaikie was a firm that was growing. As I mentioned, in 1989, the Toronto office was founded by Norm Bacall with 3 other partners, 4 other lawyers. Soon after that, Vancouver opened. Trois-Rivières, an affiliated office in Beverly Hills for a decade. Sherbrooke, Quebec City, Ottawa, then later Calgary, and finally, and painfully, Paris. That's a discussion for another day. So if you look at this is a period of spectacular growth. When Pierre Trudeau joins the firm in 1984, he's the 40th lawyer. A year after Norm Bacall founds the Toronto office in 1990, they're already up to 70 lawyers in 2 offices. They more than triple in size over the course of a single decade, from 70 to 250 lawyers in 2000. And by the end of the 2000s, there are 480 lawyers at HEENAN BLAIKIE. And by 2012, according to the Law Times counts 561 lawyers at HEENAN BLAIKIE, making it the 7th largest firm in Canada. Of course, we all know what follows from this spectacular growth, which was a equally, if not more so, spectacular collapse in 2014. Now, I said I was only going to speak a little bit about the collapse, and this is where I speak a little bit about the collapse. The conventional wisdom is that the collapse of HEENAN BLAIKIE, as you read, this is taken right from the headlines, started with a rogue African arms deal and also a botched succession for managing partners and for Roy as chairman of the firm in 2011 and 2012. There are other contributing factors. So the conventional narrative goes, the end of 2 massive cases, one in Toronto and one in Montreal, as well as taking on a huge lease in the Bay Adelaide building. Some of you who may be fans of the TV show Suits know that it's filmed, the exterior of the building is the Bay Adelaide building in Toronto. I think that these explanations are superficial, however. Many firms face crises and scandal and survive. And the issue is not, for many large organizations, are you going to face adversity? It's how do you deal with it? Do you have the tools to deal with adversity? And we can think back to Johnson & Johnson, one of the world's largest pharmaceutical companies, in the 1980s, faced a huge crisis in that there was somebody had laced Tylenol with cyanide in the Chicago area, and 7 people died. We don't have to go south of the border to see other huge crises. In 2008, 22 people died of listeria in contaminated meat in Maple Leaf Foods in Canada. There are other firms that have faced crises. You might have heard of a recent one. I'm not asking for volunteers, but I understand that there were some problems with the internet for a couple of days with one of the providers. My understanding is they're still around. SNC-Lavalin, a company that was engulfed in scandal, also still operating. So I think there's something more going on here. And that's what I'm trying to delve into in the book. And when I go back, I think that the 1990s were critical years for HEENAN BLAIKIE. You saw that they were critical years of growth, but there were also critical years where I think the seeds of the firm's ultimate demise were planted. There were decisions as well as events that wouldn't have an impact right away, but would have an impact down the road. One of them we've already mentioned, and that is the departure of Peter Blaikie in 1993. Johnston, Heenan, and Blaikie were 3 incredibly strong-willed individuals. And Don Johnston really acted as, whether it was as a mediator or as a balancing force between Peter Blaikie and Roy Heenan. When Don left, you had the stark tension between Roy Heenan, who was a dreamer, a conceptual person, a big thinker, somebody who wasn't concerned about penny pinching, about finances. And you had Peter Blaikie, who was much more business-like, managerial-like. And the two of them often clashed, but because when you had the two strong-willed men bringing different perspectives, they seemed to balance and everything seemed to work. When Peter left, essentially HEENAN BLAIKIE from 1993 on became Roy's firm. And there was no one who could counterbalance Roy. Roy had great strengths, but also great weaknesses, and nobody was able to keep those in check. So that was the first succession. Talk about HEENAN BLAIKIE being a different sort of law firm. In 1993, in Toronto, the Toronto office hired a lawyer named Bob Donaldson. He was somebody with, let's say, a sketchy past who had been sanctioned by who had been suspended for 2 years by the Law Society of Upper Canada. He was untouchable on Bay Street, but HEENAN BLAIKIE was willing to take a chance on him. HEENAN BLAIKIE, people often said that people deserve a second chance. HEENAN BLAIKIE was willing to take chances, and that's another word for risk, on powerful men who had potential to bring in a lot of money. That experiment was a failed experiment. And Donaldson left after 4 years. But that also showed that HEENAN was willing to do things differently, willing to take risks. The second succession, Jean Pavin, who had been the managing partner, and people felt was an incredibly strong managing partner, died tragically young of cancer. And he was replaced by Norm Bacall and Guy Tremblay as co-managing partners. French and English, Montreal and Toronto, Jewish and Gentile. It shows both like the classical Canadian view of diversity from the 1960s, both a positive diversity and a limited vision of diversity, and also a very, very Canadian approach to institutions that we might be more familiar with at the Supreme Court of Canada or in cabinet than at a law firm. And then in 1998, the firm merged with Marcel Aubu to form HEENAN BLAIKIE Aubu. And all I'll say about Marcel Aubu is that he was a larger than life personality. If you want to read more about him, you can just Google him or wait to read the chapter in my book. And I would just say that his values were inimical to the values at the founding in 1973. And there's a lot more that can be said about that, and that will be said about that in another time. By the end of the 1990s, HEENAN BLAIKIE still doesn't have a written partnership agreement, but there's now over 250 lawyers working there. They're spread across 8 cities in Canada. They are no longer really be like a family. And they never adapted to the modern governance and management structures that are commensurate with its growing size and complexity. You can talk about your colleagues or your workplace being like a family, and HEENAN BLAIKIE was run very much like a family business with centralized control, Roy as the dad, as the father who knew best. But there was, like in many family businesses, there was not a lot of sharing of information and a failure to bring in experienced professionals from outside the family. Also, during this period, in the late 1990s, but much more into the late 2000s, there was a move from us to them or from we to I. A partnership, and I leave it to Professor Anthony Van Duzer to teach and explain about partnership, but a legal partnership is a somewhat strange legal creature, right? It really is no more than the collection of individuals who form a partnership. Partnership is the legal vehicle of choice for law firms. That made a lot of sense when most partnerships were 2, 3, 4 lawyers. But can you really have a partnership in spirit when you've got 200 partners? You don't know, you see a partner once a year. at a corporate retreat. That's a challenge, not just for HEENAN Blaikie, that is for all large law firms, many large organizations that have the partnership structure. Over time, more and more lawyers at HEENAN Blaikie stopped talking about the firm in we terms and talked about it more and more as them, that the firm was something outside of them. Even though as a legal entity, they were a partner, they were owners, and that the firm was really just a collection of them, which is why law firm partnership names are the names of the individual partners. And for years in Quebec, they included the names of all of the partners. And every time a partner left, they had to change the name of the firm. Another thing happened you saw less of this we mentality of we're in it together and more of an I mentality, not from everyone, but from more individuals. What can I get from the firm? What's the compensation I deserve? How am I doing relative to my peers in the firm, outside of the firm? And so over time, these founding principles were eroded. If you looked at these founding principles in the 2000s, a lot of them would no longer be recognizable. HEENAN Blaikie was a firm desperately in need of structure. It did not have a written partnership agreement until 2004. When they adopted a written partnership agreement, it was a bare bones written partnership agreement of 8 pages. And one of the interesting things that I've noted over the years, and I saw in this study, is that lawyers frequently act in ways that totally contrary to how they would advise their clients in so many different areas. Why that is, I think that's a sociological or a psychological study. But corporate lawyers would be advising the clients who had a large, complex business structure to have a detailed partnership agreement to define their rights and responsibilities. HEENAN Blaikie didn't have any agreement until 2004, at which time they had over 300 lawyers and never had a really detailed one. Avoiding large differences in compensation. By the 2000s, that was gone. The differences in compensation between the highest paid partner and the most junior partners would be modest. By the time of 2012, the highest paid partners were earning 1.4 million. The lowest paid partners were earning 200,000. That is a big spread. We often talk about the spread in terms of multiples. A 3-to-1 multiple being low, that's what they were aspiring to. A 7-to-1 multiple is huge. Delegating work and client responsibility as soon as possible. For many partners, that also went out the window, claiming my client, my responsibility, my billings, my remuneration. So at some point, by the late 2000s, at least, HEENAN Blaikie had clearly changed. It was not the same law firm that it once was. And to many people, it started to look less different from other big law firms. And as I'm wrapping up, I want to offer some concluding thoughts, maybe to preempt what is always the question when I tell people about HEENAN Blaikie, which is people always want to know, like, why did it fail? Why did it fail? And I can offer some concluding observations. The first is about vision and strategy. HEENAN Blaikie lacked a clear vision for the firm. It was a firm with offices in Montreal, Trois-Rivières, Quebec City, and Sherbrooke. That sounds like a regional law firm. But it was also a law firm with offices in Montreal, Quebec City, Ottawa, Calgary, Toronto, Vancouver. That's a national law firm. and Paris and other international ventures. Was it an international law firm? Not sure. Peter Blaikie, Don Johnson, and Roy Heenan wanted to create a full service law firm. You can have a full service law firm in a single city. Roy Heenan wanted to create a national network of labor practices. Then you have the international. So you had this lack of a clear vision that was never articulated to the partners, let alone bought in by them. And following from the lack of vision is they had a lack of strategy. You need to have an objective, and then you create a strategy to actually execute on that. And I think one of the flaws of HEENAN BLAIKIE is that they saw growth as a strategy. Growth is not a strategy. Growth is a means to an end. It's a means of achieving your goals. And those goals were never clear. And what they also didn't realize was that that spectacular growth put their unique culture at risk. Culture is incredibly strong. And what comes out of this research project, HEENAN BLAIKIE, is the strength and the uniqueness of the HEENAN BLAIKIE culture that was created and nurtured and cultivated in Montreal and transplanted to Toronto and then transplanted to Vancouver. But over time, that culture eroded. It was taken for granted. And it is very hard to double and triple in size every decade with maintaining a distinct culture. You can do it, but you have to absolutely work at it. The fourth theme is the tension between law as a profession and law as a business. Something that I've written about before. Often there's this debate that goes on, is law a profession or is it a business? It's a false debate. It is clearly both. Law is both a profession, and we talk about the legal industry. A law firm practicing law is practicing a profession while operating a business, whether you are a sole practitioner, a small law firm leader, or a large law firm. And one of the things, HEENAN BLAIKIE neglected the business side of the equation. And I think part of what you see is what the risks that can happen when you neglect the business side of the equation. The fifth observation is about the legal market. And that is that the collapse of HEENAN BLAIKIE shows that this was a law firm failure, not a market failure. And you see this in a number of ways. First of all, no other law firm collapsed after HEENAN BLAIKIE. We're now almost a decade later. And there was a lot of, say, scaremongering in the legal press at the time. And there are experts in the room who would remember the legal press that said there are other law firms teetering on the brink of collapse. And that was written in, I believe, December 2013. There are a number of law firms teetering on the brink of collapse. After HEENAN BLAIKIE was just the first to fail. Who will come next? That didn't happen. Now there was consolidation. There were other explanations. The other thing is this wasn't about a lack of work. One of the interesting or amazing stories is that 500 lawyers across the country, almost all of them found jobs relatively quickly. Now, for some people, it took longer, and there are other reasons. When you're later in your career, it often becomes harder to get a job. One of the great stories of HEENAN BLAIKIE involves the extent to which the profession in each of these cities stepped up to take on the students who were displaced. 3 cadres of students. Students, imagine you're an articling student in the middle of your articles in February. You're 4 months to go until you finish your articles and your firm collapses. Or you're supposed to start articling in August of that year. You're in your 3rd year here at Ottawa or at McGill or wherever, and like life's your oyster, you're not going to class so much. And then you suddenly read like your law firm is gone. Where are you going to article? or you're a 2L and you have a summer job all lined up starting in May or June. The profession stepped up, and through the works of people like Andre Bacchus in Toronto, who was the director of student recruitment, who didn't, the firm had announced that it was winding up on February 4th or February 6th, 2014. Andre Bacchus did not leave his office, made calls until every single one of those 3 cohorts of students got a job somewhere else. Wow. That is there are many great stories like this about people who stepped up to support each other. And you saw that great ethos about, I would say, the best of HEENAN BLAIKIE and the best of the Canadian legal profession. So it wasn't a market failure. Ultimately, the HEENAN BLAIKIE, for me, is a case study about many things about large law firms in Canada, but large law firms generally, large firms beyond law, but also the Canadian legal profession. But its failure and collapse is very much a singular and unique story, almost a decade later. And it leaves open a number of questions. Roy's vision of Roy and Don's vision and Peter's vision of you go to work to have fun, having a fun place to work, of not worrying so much about the bottom line, is at once both noble and also romantic. The idea of a different sort of law firm with less emphasis on the bottom line, on billables and receivables and remuneration. But at some point, you grow too big to be run like a family business, and you're no longer like a family, and you need structure. And for HEENAN BLAIKIE, that realization came too late. Thank you very much. Merci. Happy to take questions, or maybe a couple online, but happy to start with people in the room.
Interesting.
Yes, Stephen Bidman.
Can you go back to the picture, the previous slide? Is that a shot of the actual HEENAN office? And does it say, if it is it there because it makes a statement about HEENAN BLAIKIE? Or is it just, sorry about that, put you on the spot.
Sure. Well, obviously, the HEENAN BLAIKIE sign is signed outside the HEENAN BLAIKIE office. I'm not sure which office, but obviously it's
Montreal.
where there's snow. So I guess would have been Quebec.
Montreal.
This is a generic. I would have to go back and check. I was looking for photos of Bay Adelaide. I was trying to convey the image of a huge amount of empty offices and that sort of that human displacement.
I thought you were maybe trying to show like glass walls in the office, like they're different. I hear your interpretation of it, and but I guess what I was struck more by was the glass. I don't know.
I think there could be a separate talk on architecture in here. Yes.
In your interviews with the lawyers and the students, did any of them mention that they missed the culture of HEENAN BLAIKIE
Absolutely.
and that they wanted to recreate into the future?
That's a great question. So I hope that the microphone picked it up. I'll repeat it, which is, and sorry, what's your name again?
Jaina.
Jaina asked in my interviews with HEENAN BLAIKIE lawyers and students to mention that they missed the culture and hope to recreate it. On the first point, absolutely. Like I was astounded by the number of lawyers who had this incredible sense of loss. And I think many of people went through stages of grief, of losing this supportive community around them. But also what amazed me, and I didn't get into this, is in a partnership, partners are owners of a business. So 200 plus partners had usually several $100,000 in equity invested in HEENAN BLAIKIE that they all lost. So they had real reason, and many people suffered personal loss because of that. Some Heenan Blaikie partners had to put another mortgage on their home or sell their home to cover the bank. Even people who have lost several $100,000, like, have reason to be angry. And I was just amazed at the number of people that said, notwithstanding this, notwithstanding all of this, notwithstanding these other bad experiences, working there was the best experience of my life. Working there was magical. It was, I missed those people. And they would often mention individuals by name. I missed that one. I'd say. Your other question is a great one. Do they wish to recreate it? I think there was a sense of that this was sort of capturing something special that happened in a particular era that was unlikely to be able to be replicated on that scale. I think that there are some people in a smaller context, in a smaller firm that may have tried to replicate it with some success, but trying to replicate that in a large firm context, law or otherwise, with however many hundreds of people is really challenging. Great question. Katie Black.
I worked at HEENAN BLAIKIE from 2010 to 2012. So I was a first-year lawyer. And what I find fascinating, when you ask why did HEENAN BLAIKIE fail, people ask why HEENAN BLAIKIE failed. I've thought about this so much. I wasn't there when it failed. I had left before. And the impression that I received is, you said when you get to a certain size, you need structure. I would phrase it differently. I'd say, okay, obviously you need some sort of human resources structure. HEENAN BLAIKIE had that, okay? But what HEENAN BLAIKIE didn't have was values and identity. There was no clear identity that unified that group of people, such that the Ottawa office was its own satellite and had different values from the Toronto office, which had different values from the Montreal office, where you characterized it as that's us versus them, bang on, which is Ottawa versus Toronto, Toronto versus Montreal. And what was crystal clear was there was this sense of loss of almost bitterness. And this is in 2010, where the grief, you could sense the grief in people who'd worked with Roy or people who'd worked within HEENAN BLAIKIE that early, where people knew what it had been. So they were comparing in terms of the expectations, they were trying to hold their current firm where they worked to the expectations of what it had been, and it never made it. It was impossible for it to make it, given its size or given the denaturing of Roy's influence over everybody, his unifying structure, et cetera. But what I found is that discord between the expectations and the reality created this bitterness that was just below the surface, which as a first-year student or first-year lawyer, you walk in the room and people are having conversations or decisions are being made. And you're like, there's an elephant in here that I don't even know what it is. Like, there was palpable discomfort when certain decisions are being discussed, such that even at the most junior level, you know that the parents are fighting, but they're not fighting in front of us and they won't tell us what's going on. And that creates this sense of unease, which is what the differential in values is what I think at the end of the day, the lack of identity led, because of the corporate structure, the fact that it's a partnership led to that denaturing.
Those are great observations. The thing I would add on to that is sort of that when you talk about like the different values in different offices, that one of the things that made HEENAN BLAIKIE different from other law firms in that sort of lack of structure was people said, and these are people from the 70s, 80s, even into the 90s, so in the 2000s, oh, it was great. Like, you could do whatever you right? Like at large firms, you're often told, you know, these are the sorts of clients, these are the sorts of cases. At Heenan, you had that freedom to develop your practice as you wanted, and they supported people in doing that. There's a flip side to which is the structure. On the extreme end is anarchy. Not saying it was anarchical, but what also meant is that in many ways, HEENAN BLAIKIE is a great Canadian story, and it was a decentralized federation. And so there wasn't a lot of connection between the Vancouver office and the Calgary office and the Montreal and the Toronto office. And so it was, you know, and this is an issue with all partnerships. What ties them together, or are they a collection of offices, practice groups, individual lawyers? Yes.
When will your book be finished and when will we be able to read it?
As the dean said, I still have a few more chapters that I'm working on, which is slow because of my renewal of teaching responsibilities and my commitment to teaching. It's great to see some of my students out here. So I'm hoping to certainly complete by the end of the calendar year, beginning of next year. And then you'll I'm sure, like email, we'll certainly let you know when the book will be available.
So not for Christmas.
Not for Christmas 2023, but Christmas 2022, but hopefully for Christmas 2023 or any holiday in 2024.
We have some questions online. Easier for you.
Of the three founding principles abandoned over time through the firm's growth plans, we feel that if the leadership team had properly preserved any one of the three throughout the critical pre-collapse period, it may have saved the firm, so to speak. That's a great question. It's really hard to look back in retrospect and say, would any one decision have saved the firm? In the same way that I don't think that there's any one event that cataclysmic event, or even two that sunk the firm. I think in order to, there's a difference between, you know, buying into at the sort of founding stage. Organizations have different stages, right? Of a founding stage, a commitment to those principles. The challenge for a partnership or for any structure is, how do you sort of recommit to those principles? And HEENAN BLAIKIE was a place where they were really willing to earn less money than they could have at other firms because of the unique culture. Norm Bacall talks about it like that as the Heenan tax. You're going to earn less money here. People were told at the time, you're going to earn less money here, but we have way more fun. And people bought into that, and they agreed with that, but it changed over time. And over time, people were earning less money than they could have elsewhere, and it was not fun. And that's when you have a real problem. So I think that, you know, to the question, I'm not sure there's any one thing, but there are firms that are known for, okay, this is what we're about. And if you identify to, you know, to Katie's point, there's nothing more sort of dangerous than the gap between expectations that are set and the experiences that people have. There are firms that say, you know, we are about working hard and making a lot of money. Come here, this is what we're about. That's what it's, and they're consistent with that. Now, there are other firms that say we are about three things, and we commit to these three things, and this is all we practice in. You want to practice in this other area? We're not the place for you. Being sort of clear about what you're about and what your values are, I think, are really important. So somebody was at a firm that almost joined HEENAN BLAIKIE. The death of Jean Potvin was a shock to the firm, given his strong leadership skills. Did your research touch upon his role? Absolutely. And so just to remind people, Jean Potvin was a tax lawyer. He has been a litigator for the federal government. He joined HEENAN BLAIKIE in the mid-1970s. And he succeeded Peter as the firm's managing partner in 1993. He was well prepared for that role because Peter had often been involved in and away from the firm on politics. Peter had run as a conservative candidate for Parliament several times. He was the president of the Progressive Conservative Party of Canada for a number of years. And Peter and Jean Pauvin was always his number two and sort of stepping in and running the firm. Jean Pauvin was a person who my research showed was incredibly well respected throughout the firm. Respected in Montreal, but also respected in Toronto. And people told me about a meeting in Toronto that involved associates, junior lawyers, as well as partners. They were saying, you know, the dissatisfaction that they felt, and they felt that Jean came from Montreal to Toronto to listen to them, took notes. They felt that he was somebody who was really listening to them and would do his best to address them. So there are some people that say, well, things would have been different if he had lived, because also he was somebody who had a much stronger relationship with Roy Heenan. I think Guy Tremblay or Norm Bacall did, in terms of being able to deal with some of Roy's excesses. And I think that Guy Tremblay and Norm Bacall had more challenges in dealing with some of Roy's excesses.
So my name is Marie Poulin, and I'm a graduate of this law school, but I started my law school at 59 years old because of Roy Heenan. I first met Roy Heenan when I was vice president of industrial relations at CBC Radio-Canada. We had 33 unions. And Roy's firm was on a contract for strategic advice for our industrial relations. And we had 33 union agreements coming up. And because of Roy and his strategy and his philosophy about industrial relations, believe it or not, we renegotiated without a hitch in 10 months. And I give the credit to Roy Heenan, but he's the one who convinced me to go back to law school once I was a parliamentarian in the Senate so I could understand legislation. And then he brought me in as an articling student in 2008. So fast forward to 2014, we're in Toronto at a dinner. And Roy says to me, Marie, can I talk to you alone, please? And don't forget, the collapse date is February the 4th to the 6th. And Roy says to me, I wanted to let you know privately that I'm retiring as chairman of HEENAN BLAIKIE. And I said to him, Roy, you can't leave. You can't leave now. He said, Marie, I'm 77. I'm sort of invited to leave. I said, no, Roy, you can't leave. He said, why? I said, do you realize how many changes have occurred within the firm in the last 5 years? And I start listing them out. He says, so they're all good people. I said, a good friend of mine was Dr. Van Dusen, a psychiatrist. And she had convinced me that when an individual has too many adaptations at once in his or her life, good or bad, they have a depression. You can't take on too much at the same time. And I said, it's therefore happening in the firm. You've got to stay on and you've got to maintain stability. Give it 2 years. Don't leave. I'm begging you. He said, oh, but my replacement is fantastic. Fast forward, he invited me to lunch after the collapse in June. We're in Montreal he had a favorite Chinese restaurant in Montreal that he always went to. And we're sitting at the table and he said, Marie, I wanted to officially apologize. Why didn't I listen to you? He said, HEENAN BLAIKIE was my baby, was my family. I raised it up. It became a glowing adult. And look what happened. And I said, stop feeling guilty. Stop taking responsibility. we were all responsible. We were all there, and you can't blame yourself and you can't blame anybody. But Roy Heenan, coming back to Roy Heenan, was an extraordinary human being and an outstanding lawyer, a good family man, and a man with a lot of artistic taste. And yes, that is the picture of the Toronto office after the closure, because all the art is down, because there were art pieces on all those walls there. But that is the Toronto office. Thanks.
Thank you. I'll leave with this. One final point, which I think is appropriate for this audience, which is picking up on Marie's point about Roy inspiring her to go to the law school. Roy and Dawn and Peter loved teaching, and they taught at McGill, they taught at Sherbrooke. They were absolutely committed to teaching. And when you look at Roy's obituary and all of the accolades that he received, he mentioned that he taught at McGill, that he taught at the Université de Montréal, that he taught here at some point, and that he taught at Queen's. It doesn't do that to show, the honor. It showed that teaching was important to him. And of the many innovations that HEENAN Blaikie brought in, and we talk about being a different sort of law firm, they initiated something in Montreal that we take for granted now, which is called recruiting at law school. They recruited lawyers from the ranks of their students in their classes. And before that, the most frequent way of hiring law students was through family connections. So that is one of their many enduring legacies. Thank you very much.
Kicking up our year with such a fascinating lecture. No more to be said now, other than thank for your service. I'll take a sandwich on your way. Funny. Hope to see you later in the bar next event in November. I'll be announced for those.
Later, yeah.